Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you this case where I failed to execute the double chop technique successfully. And I'm going to do a careful analysis of why it happened, how to avoid it, and how I'm able to still proceed with disassembling this lens. You will see that this lens is a fairly dense lens, and when I apply the chop forces, I didn't execute the technique properly. And I'll break it down to you, and you can see why this happened. So you'll see here, this is a fairly dense lens. And so I'm going to go ahead and remove the epinuclear material, place the chopper around the lens, placing the phaco tip vertically, but see what happens? I don't fracture the lens completely in half. And that is because of poor execution. So let's see here. The chopper is in the proper position. I have the chopper out to the equator. It's vertical. It's hugging the lens from below. But look at the phaco tip. I don't have it completely vertical. And as I'm bringing the instruments together, the phaco tip is moving upward, but the chopper doesn't come with an equal opposing force towards the phaco tip. So see what happens? The phaco tip is forward, it's gliding more on the surface. The chopper doesn't move towards the phaco tip. And then I just kind of get this partial anterior lens chop. It's not a full thickness chop. And so go ahead and do the cross chop, but because the phaco tip is not in between the lens pieces, that also fails. So the cross chop is not effective, the double chop is not effective. And so you really need to have that equal opposing force with the chopper coming towards the center, the phaco tip coming towards the center. Again, the chopper is around the lens, but it's a little bit more posterior, hugging the lens from below. The phaco tip is positioned vertically subincisionally, and then you have to push down and towards the center with the phaco tip, and you're embedding the phaco tip into the lens, and that should give you that effective chop. So you can see here now, I'm trying to manipulate the lens and I rotate it a little bit. I'm going to try to execute the double chop maneuver one more time. You can see I have a bunch of little pieces that are somewhat jigsawed, partially chopped. So I place the chopper around the lens, turning the phaco tip vertically to some degree, and I'm able to fracture that distal half. But again, subincisionally, it didn't fracture, probably because I had already tried to chop, and it creates these additional fissures, and I didn't get a full propagated chop all the way through and through the entire lens. So use some vacuum to lift that piece up, crush it into smaller and smaller pieces, because I did effectively chop that distal piece using the mechanical chopping forces to crush the lens pieces into smaller pieces and then emulsifying the lens piece. You can see I'm just trying to rotate the lens. I've placed the chopper around that one piece, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip. This is essentially like a cross chop maneuver now, because again, I don't have a full chop. I use the vacuum to lift that piece up and then perform that scissoring chop maneuver where I turned the phaco tip sideways, and I was able to amputate the posterior adhesion in that case right there. But you can see again, this is a fairly dense lens, and that's another reason why you have to be very intentional about your forces when you're trying to fracture the lens. Those equal and opposing forces are so important, because with a dense lens like this, if you don't execute it right, it won't achieve that successful chop. So right here, I'm trying to get at that posterior adhesion. I got underneath that piece with the chopper and then crushed that adhesion between the instruments. Placing the chopper around that one piece and then perform the cross chop maneuver, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip and then crushing it. There was a little bit of a posterior adhesion. I was able to get underneath it with the chopper, and with a scissoring chop, amputated the posterior adhesion. Lifting that piece up with some vacuum, crushing it between the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens piece. So again, it's a very, more haphazard, less organized and systematic chopping and disassembling, but it's still working. Placing the chopper around the lens piece here, placing the phaco tip deep in the bag now that there's more space, able to fracture the lens completely in half. Again, using crushing forces to break up the piece into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens piece. Again, I think you can appreciate how dense this lens is. For softer lenses, if you don't execute the chop completely well, you can still go after it and crush it again, and it's not a big deal. But with a denser lens, you do have to execute that chopping force to be able to fracture that dense lens. So again, I'm doing more cross-chop maneuvers, placing the chopper around the lens piece, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip, crushing the lens piece into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens piece. I take the chopper out. I'm pushing more viscoelastic into the anterior chamber and coating the corneal endothelium here. I have one quadrant left. Placing the chopper around the lens piece, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip, fracturing the lens in half, doing that scissoring chop, amputating the posterior adhesion. Now it's free, crushing the lens between the instruments, and then using pulses of ultrasonic energy and vacuum to emulsify the lens piece. Grabbing that final piece, crushing it between the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens pieces. So now I have the epinucleus, which is a pretty thick and stiff epinuclear material, making sure the chopper is deep. So I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the phaco tip out, and I go in with the INA handpiece. I start sub-incisionally. The cortex comes out pretty easily. It was already fairly loose. Switch to polish mode, polishing underneath the rexus edge. Pulsing BSS into the sub-incisional capsule fornix. There's some stuff coming out there. Filling the bag with some cohesive viscoelastic. Sweeping underneath the rexus edge of any lens epithelial cells, first on the left side and then the right side. This is a single piece acrylic lens. It's going to go into the capsular bag. Go in with irrigation off, activating irrigation, making sure the haptics are off the optic. Go underneath the lens, tilting it and rotating it 90 degrees, removing the viscoelastic from within the bag, repositing the optic back down, polishing underneath the rexus edge some more, switching to visco mode, and then I'll hydrate my incision. So again, this is a patient who had a failed double chop, and that's because I didn't tilt the phaco tip vertically as much. I didn't push down and embed the phaco tip into the lens material and then enact that opposing force with the chopper. In order to embed into the lens with the phaco tip, when you're turning it vertically sub-incisionally, you have to have the chopper applying that opposing force because you're supposed to crush the lens on both sides. But instead, what I did was I kept the chopper out where the equator was. I didn't bring it towards the center. And as I pushed the phaco tip forward, it just kind of, I was able to get through some part of the lens, the anterior lens, but I slid it off across forward without the chopper bringing and applying that opposing force. If I was able to apply two opposing and equal forces, it would have fractured the lens completely in half. But because I didn't do that, I got a partial chop, but then I had to do the cross chop maneuver. And of course, the cross chop maneuver relies upon the phaco tip being deep between the lens pieces in order to be that opposing force as the chopper is pulled toward the center and it's crushed against the phaco tip. So again, a series of mistakes which all began with poor execution, poor instrument positioning. But as you can see, even though that happened, I'm able to still apply the same principles and techniques, and I went back and applied again more mechanical fracturing principles. I was able to achieve a good, satisfactory double chop maneuver finally, but that because the lens was already broken up, it only fractured the distal half. I was able to bring up that first quadrant, emulsify the lens piece, and once there's space there, I'm able to execute more fracturing techniques because I can place that fingertip deep in the bag between the lens pieces, and so you can apply that horizontal force more efficiently by crushing and sandwiching the lens pieces. So again, it shows that even though you don't perform the double chop successfully, if you're experienced with the technique and you know what you're doing, you can still very easily and confidently, without difficulty, still disassemble a lens like this. It happens to be somewhat of a dense lens. And so don't despair if you're having trouble with the double chop and cross chop maneuvers. You can see I've essentially developed this technique, and sometimes it still happens to me too. The good news is you can always get yourself out of trouble. And as long as you're paying attention and you're really intentional with how you execute the technique, you really shouldn't run into trouble. But when you do, at least you can get yourself out of it. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.